Okay, so for the last couple of videos, you guys have heard me talking about how I don't really like to use the grid. The reason for that is that I like to use structural lines, so you can see that video that I've done on structural lines so that you can also, kind of get the same sense of how to fix your proportions and get proportions correct, but it's a little bit simpler of a structure that's based on the object itself rather than just a generic grid that lays over everything. However, there are a couple other devices that I use that are similar to a grid, but I think they're simpler and they're easier and they're more specific to whatever it is that you wish to draw rather than that overlay. So this one I'm going to talk to you about is called axis lines. So an axis is basically an imaginary line that would bisect the body. It's a line on which the body would rotate, so it would be the center of the object. So you can see that when I'm putting my dowel in the cup to show you what an axis line is, I'm not going to be putting it down at the edge or towards the front of the rim. I'm actually putting it in the center of the cup. And then you want to imagine that it goes all the way through and would come out the other side. That's what your axis line is. And so if I put a line here in a symmetrical object like that, I can then look at this half and try to compare them to see if they're the same or different or if my lines need to move. So by imagining these axis lines, it's actually a much easier way to look at your proportion and your structure to create an accurate drawing. So let's take a look at how I would do that on the page with some photographs, because I think it's a little bit easier with the camera setup for me to show you on photographs. If you can draw these at home using an actual 3D object, your drawings are going to look much better in the long run. So I don't want you to just use photographs, but for illustrating this, I'm going to use the photographs. So let's take a look. So the first one that I want to show you is a photograph of a glass jar that I have. What I've done is I've drawn one central axis line that's bisecting the jar in half. And then I can do the same thing on my page. So I'm going to take my page, make sure that I line up a vertical line, and I'm going to aim for the center. It might not be perfectly in the center. And then I'm going to draw a central axis line. The next thing that I did, you can see that I put horizontal dots at the widest parts of the curve, the narrowest part, and the end of the neck, and then at the bottom. I can then go to this page and try to do the same thing. I can use either my ruler, although I don't want to use the numbers. It might be easier to use a dowel if you don't want to use numbers. And I'm just going to use the dowel to show where the horizontal edge is. And then I want to create an equal space on each side, so I'm visualizing that this length is equal to this length. I can always use sighting, so I can check to see if those lengths are accurate. If you need to watch my sighting video, you can follow a link over here. Then I'm going to do another horizontal edge, and what I can do is trace this one up, follow this one up, and then again you can sight this side to make sure that it's equal to this side. It looks like I'm a little bit off, so down here I was probably off and I need to make that correction. I'm not going to take the time to do that now because I just want to show you exactly how to do this step by step. But I would want to make those corrections. And then I'm going to do these, and I'm going to guess about the space. I want it to be a similar spacing. And then so it's a similar spacing from the axis line, and then also a similar spacing in the height. And then I'm going to do the correct spacing this way, and a similar spacing in terms of the width this way. So that is a great way to set up those axis lines, and then you kind of have an outline that you can start to sketch in to see if your proportions are correct and to see if that jar is drawn properly. Okay, so there's a really quick example. I would have to do more in order to do the lid and to do all the details, but that's one way to start. I want to show you a couple other that are more complex. So here's a picture of my friend Ellen's horse, Tomba. And I also showed you that, actually, I want to swap out the picture. Well, that would take too long. Let's not do that. So I kind of have a poor quality picture in here. But what I wanted to show you is that rather than gridding Tomba off and then gridding my page off like I did before, it might be easier just to show a few axis lines. So what I did was I cut his face laterally in half from side to side. I went right through the eye because I wanted that to be a guide for where I could put the eye on the page rather than making it perfectly symmetrical so that this half is equal to this half. So now the way that I did it, this top half of his nose is a little bit shorter than the bottom half where his cheek is, and that's okay. It's a little bit more symmetrical down here where his muzzle is, but I really wanted to get a guide for where the eye was going to fall. So then I tried to create that same line over here on my page, and one of the things I looked at was where is this spacing compared to this spacing? And then I looked at where is this spacing compared to this. So my page is larger, and yet I wanted it to be proportionate so that this is a scaled up version of this distance so that they're similar. Then I put in another line over here that I wanted to go sort of partway through his neck and partway through his ears. And then I created that same axis line here. And then just because I felt like I needed something to break up the space a little bit further, I decided to do a horizontal line that cut just about halfway through his head. And so then I put one of those here. And then all I need to do in order to do the drawing is that I look at where this space is to create this line. So I'm looking at this distance, and I want that to be similar, maybe scaled up slightly because this is a larger proportion. And then I'm going to put in this line. I'm watching where this line falls when it runs into the ear here, and I can actually see that I need his ear to be a little bit more detailed. This triangle comes down right here, and then this part comes down here, and this looks like it leans a little bit more forward than I had it. So you're going to wind up doing one version and then making changes to it. It's not usually going to guarantee that your first version is perfectly correct. However, it's going to get you closer to getting the correct proportions so that then when you go to shade this in, your proportions are going to be more accurate. I can see that this gap is bigger than this gap is. I want it to be slightly bigger because of the scaling up that I'm doing here. This is larger. However, I think his ear needs to lean more forward like this. So I can make that change, erase my helper line. Remember, those are helper lines, not wrong lines. And I've got that video on helper lines, so if you want to go back and watch that one too, you can. It kind of changes your attitude so that you don't feel like you've made a mistake all the time. You can instead think of it like that line helped me out because it got me closer to the accurate mark. So there's another little change I can make. And I could probably finesse this and tweak it on and off for, you know, an hour if I wanted to. It depends on how detailed I want it and how perfectly photographically copied I want it to be. I usually take things a little bit with a grain of salt because I want it to look like a horse. It doesn't have to look like a photographic image of this horse when I'm drawing it. So then I'm going to follow those steps all the way around. You can see I put in his ear, I put in his hair, then I came down his nose. I looked at the distance between the middle line here and the nose, and I tried to create a larger scale version of it. I looked at where on this axis line these cheeks sort of came in, and maybe this needs to be moved a little bit. So I can always make tweaks, but having just 3 axis lines really gives you a head start on getting your proportions in a more accurate place. Let's take a look at one more. This one is a photograph of a duck. It's a mallard, I believe, and my friend Mark took this photograph. It's pretty cool. So it's a duck floating in the water. You can see his reflection. And some of the more difficult parts of a duck, I would say, would be getting the head and the angle right. Especially with the reflection, you've got two heads that you've got to draw. So you can see that what I did was one axis line here that bisects the body. I'm going to use the dowel because you might be able to see that better. And I just picked a spot that seemed like it was about halfway from this way to this way. It's probably a little bit longer this side than this side, and that's okay. And then I wanted to get a sense of the angle. So this time I didn't go through the center of the eye because I felt like that was going to be off in terms of the angle. Instead, I went through the angle of the bill or the beak, and then I did the same on the reflection. And then when I set that up on my page, you can see I set up the central axis line, and then I went through this angle for the bill and this angle for the bill. And then I was able to draw in my outline, and I can always check things like how far does the head stick down. I can see that this actually looks like it needs to be a little bit lower, and this maybe a little bit lower as well. So it gives me a device to check my lines and to check my proportions. Then I can go in there with my Mono 0 eraser. This is the round version. Make sure you don't get confused and order the square version. It's a little bit more cumbersome. And so that gives me a way to really start to look at what are the shapes that I'm seeing, and am I getting those details of the shapes not only in the right place in relationship to one another, but the right proportion and scale by themselves. So hopefully this tool is really going to help you. I think that this is probably easier to me. It's simpler, it's more intuitive than the grid. The other thing that I really like about it is that it's making you think of the body as a full round shape, because you're thinking about that central axis going right through the object rather than sitting on the surface and flattening the image. So I find that drawings using structural line and axis lines, and then in a minute I'm going to show you plumb lines and horizontal lines and how you can use that with negative space. I find that those techniques help me to build something that's more volumetric and 3D and creating the illusion of 3D on my page rather than the grid, which kind of flattens things out. So try a couple axis lines, maybe try it with a simple object first, and then you could try it with something that's a little bit more difficult like the duck. And let me know if you guys have any questions. Thank you all so much for watching. More videos are coming soon, so if you wish to subscribe to my channel, go ahead and do that. And also you can check out my website, lzmstudio.com.